The photograph was found in 1947, buried beneath the rubble of what had once been a schoolhouse in the suburbs of Berlin. It showed 11 children, none older than 14, standing in a perfect line with rifles nearly as tall as they were. Their faces were smudged with dirt and something darker. Their eyes held no light. Behind them, smoke rose from buildings that would never stand again. The date scrawled on the back read April 1945, just weeks before the war's end. For decades, historians dismissed it as propaganda, another fabrication from the dying days of the Third Reich. But then the letters began to surface. They came from attics and basements across Europe, written in the trembling handwriting of children who had been forced to become soldiers before they understood what childhood meant. Some were addressed to parents who would never read them. Others were never finished, the sentences stopping mid-word as if the writer had simply vanished. Each one told fragments of the same impossible story. Children, some as young as 12, had been handed weapons and sent to defend a regime that was already dead. They were told they were heroes. They were promised glory. Instead, they found something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, or end those lives before they truly began. This is the story of those children. Not the ones who survived to tell sanitized versions in their old age, but the ones who lived it in real time, whose words were recorded in the moment of their breaking. It begins in the winter of 1944, when the war had already been lost, but no one had the courage to admit it. The Volkssturm decree came in September 1944, when even the most fanatical believers could see the Soviet army advancing like a winter storm from the east. Hitler's government called it a necessary mobilization of the German people. What it actually meant was that every male between 16 and 60 who could hold a rifle would be conscripted. But the truly desperate measure came later, whispered in the corridors of power before it became official policy. When the 16-year-olds ran out, they would take the 15-year-olds, then the 14-year-olds, then younger still. In a small town called Lichtenberg, just outside Berlin, a boy named Friedrich Hartmann celebrated his 13th birthday on January 15, 1945. His mother baked him a cake using the last of their rationed flour and sugar. His father, missing his left arm from the Eastern Front, watched from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. Friedrich's older brother Hans had not come home for Christmas. No one spoke about why. That evening, 2 men in Wehrmacht uniforms knocked on their door. They were not there for Friedrich's father. They were there for Friedrich. The recruitment officer was polite, almost apologetic. He explained that the fatherland needed every able body for its final defense. He assured Friedrich's mother that the boy would receive proper training, that he would be kept far from the front lines, that this was merely a precautionary measure. Every word was a lie, and everyone in that kitchen knew it. Friedrich's mother clutched her son's shoulders. His father stared at the floor. The officers waited with the patience of men who had done this many times before. Friedrich himself said nothing. He had been raised to obey. He had been raised to believe that service to Germany was the highest calling. He picked up the small bag his mother had packed with trembling hands, kissed her cheek, and walked out into the January snow. He would never see his home again. The training camp was located in what had once been a summer retreat for wealthy Berliners, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens now turned to mud and ice. Friedrich arrived with 60 other boys, some younger than him, most no older than 15. They were issued uniforms that hung loose on their small frames, boots that blistered their feet within hours, and rifles that seemed designed for men twice their size. The instructors were Wehrmacht veterans, many bearing wounds that had disqualified them from frontline service. Some treated the boys with a gruff kindness, recognizing the obscenity of what they had been ordered to do. Others had grown hard, their humanity eroded by years of war. And they drove the children as mercilessly as they would have driven seasoned soldiers. Friedrich wrote his first letter home on January 20th, 5 days after his arrival. The letter was discovered in 1989, tucked inside a book in his mother's belongings after her death. In careful, boyish handwriting, he told her that the food was adequate, that he had made a friend named Peter from Hamburg, that the drills were tiring but manageable. He asked about his father's health. He asked if there had been any word from Hans. He signed it with love and promised to write again soon. What he did not write was that he cried himself to sleep every night. That Peter from Hamburg was only 12 years old and had lied about his age to protect his older brother from conscription. That the instructors had them practice bayonet charges against straw dummies while screaming that each dummy was a Soviet soldier coming to murder their families. The training lasted 3 weeks. By the end, Friedrich could field strip his rifle blindfolded, could march 20 kilometers with full pack, could throw a grenade with reasonable accuracy. What he could not do was reconcile the person he was becoming with the child he had been. In his second letter home, written on February 8th, his handwriting was smaller, more controlled. He wrote about the tactical exercises, about learning to dig proper trenches, about the importance of defending every meter of German soil. He did not mention that 2 boys had deserted in the night and been caught. He did not mention what happened to deserters. He signed this letter differently, not with love, but with duty. His mother would later say that she knew, reading those words, that she had already lost him. If this story has moved you, if you understand why we must remember these voices that history tried to silence, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like. These stories need to be told, and your support ensures they will continue to reach those who need to hear them. On February 12, 1945, Friedrich and his unit were loaded onto trucks and driven east. They passed through villages that had been evacuated, their windows dark and doors hanging open like mouths frozen mid-scream. They passed columns of refugees moving west, families pushing carts loaded with whatever they could carry, their faces hollow with exhaustion and terror. The boys in the trucks did not wave or call out. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that they were moving toward something these people were desperately fleeing from. The sound of artillery grew louder as they traveled, a distant thunder that never quite stopped, rolling across the frozen landscape like the breath of some enormous beast. Their destination was a town called Seelow, positioned along the Oder River about 90 kilometers east of Berlin. It was here military command had decided that the Soviet advance would be halted. It was here that Germany would make its stand. The boys were billeted in a church that had been converted into a makeshift barracks, their bedrolls spread across pews where families had once gathered for Sunday services. The altar had been pushed aside to make room for ammunition crates. A statue of Christ watched over them with hands outstretched, though whether in blessing or warning, no one could say. Friedrich met his commanding officer on his second day in Seelow. Hauptmann Werner Kessler was 43 years old and had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He had a Purple Heart, an Iron Cross, and a limp from shrapnel that had shattered his hip at Stalingrad. When he looked at the boys assembled before him, at their smooth faces and undersized uniforms, something in his expression cracked. He dismissed the other officers and spoke to the children alone. He told them the truth. He told them that the Soviet forces outnumbered them 5-1, that air support would be minimal, that their ammunition supplies were already inadequate. He told them that they should not be here, that sending children to fight a war already lost was a crime against everything decent. Then he told them that none of that mattered now, because here they were and here they would likely die. But if they listened to him and followed his orders exactly, some of them might survive. Friedrich wrote his third letter that night. It was the shortest one. He told his mother that he was well, that his unit was strong, that they would hold the line. He told her not to worry. He told her he loved her. He did not mail it. There was no longer any reliable postal service from the front. He kept it folded in his breast pocket, pressed against his heart, as if the words themselves might serve as armor. The Soviet offensive began on April 16th at 3 in the morning with an artillery barrage that turned night into day. Friedrich had been asleep in the church, dreaming of his mother's kitchen, when the first shells struck. The building shook as if God himself had reached down to tear it from its foundations. Boys tumbled from their makeshift beds, scrambling for rifles and helmets in the darkness lit only by the flashes of exploding ordnance outside. Hauptmann Kessler moved among them with forced calm, directing them to their positions. His voice steady even as the walls cracked and plaster rained down like snow. They ran through streets that were already burning, past buildings collapsing inward as if the earth itself had grown tired of holding them up. Friedrich's position was a trench on the eastern edge of town, reinforced with sandbags and timber that seemed pathetically inadequate against what was coming. Peter from Hamburg was beside him, his face white as bone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely load his rifle. On Friedrich's other side was a boy named Klus, who had turned 15 2 days earlier and spent his birthday filling sandbags until his hands bled. Further down the line were others whose names Friedrich had learned but whose faces he could barely distinguish in the smoke and dust that now filled the air like fog. The artillery continued for 3 hours. Some boys prayed, some wept. Some sat in silence with their eyes closed, trying to imagine they were anywhere but here. When the barrage finally stopped, the silence was worse than the noise had been. It pressed against their eardrums, heavy and expectant. Then they heard it. The sound of engines, thousands of them, accompanied by a grinding mechanical rhythm that seemed to shake the ground itself. Tanks. The Soviet armor came forward through the smoke like prehistoric beasts, their guns swiveling methodically, searching for targets. Behind them came the infantry, waves of soldiers in brown uniforms moving with the confidence of men who knew they had already won. Hauptmann Kessler gave the order to fire. Friedrich would later write that he did not remember pulling the trigger that first time. His body had taken over, executing the training that had been drilled into him during those 3 weeks that now seemed like a lifetime ago. He fired, reloaded, fired again, the rifle bucking against his shoulder with each shot, the smell of cordite burning in his nostrils. Around him, other boys were doing the same, their faces set in expressions that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with terror held barely in check. The Soviet advance slowed, but did not stop. For every soldier that fell, 3 more took his place. How many of you have ever tried to imagine what it means to be 13 years old and holding a rifle aimed at another human being? Can you picture the weight of that moment? The impossibility of it? The battle for Silo lasted 3 days, though for Friedrich time had ceased to have any normal meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, hours collapsed into moments. He would later recall images disconnected from any chronology, fragments of experience that his mind had captured like photographs. Peter from Hamburg, crying for his mother as blood soaked through his uniform from a wound in his stomach. His 12-year-old face twisted in confusion as if he could not understand how this had happened. Klaus lying face down in the mud, his rifle still clutched in his hands, the back of his head gone. Hauptmann Kessler dragging 2 wounded boys to cover under heavy fire, his own blood leaving a trail behind him. The church collapsing inward during a direct hit, its spire falling in slow motion as if reluctant to surrender to gravity. The statue of Christ buried beneath the rubble. They fought until their ammunition ran low, then fought with grenades, then fought with whatever they could find. Soviet forces pushed into the town from 3 sides, methodical and unstoppable. On the second day, Friedrich's unit received orders to fall back to a secondary defensive position. Of the 60 boys who had arrived in Silo, 23 were still able to walk. They carried 4 wounded with them. They left the others behind, along with Hauptmann Kessler, who had taken a bullet through his lung and could no longer stand. His last order was for them to run and not look back. They obeyed. As they retreated through burning streets, they could hear him firing his pistol behind them, buying them seconds with his life. The secondary position was an abandoned factory on the western edge of town, its windows already shattered, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes from previous fighting. They held there for 6 more hours while Soviet forces surrounded them. A sergeant named Dietrich, one of the training instructors who had survived this far, took command. He was 29 years old and looked 60. He positioned the boys throughout the building, rationing what little ammunition remained, speaking in a monotone that suggested he had already accepted what was coming. When a white flag appeared from a nearby building where another German unit had been holding out, Dietrich told his boys not to watch what happened next. Most did anyway. They saw the Soviet soldiers accept the surrender, saw the German troops emerge with hands raised, saw them lined against a wall. They heard the gunfire. Dietrich gathered the remaining boys in a back room. There were 19 of them now. He told them they had 3 choices. They could surrender and hope for mercy, though they had just seen what mercy looked like. They could fight until they were overrun, which would come within the hour. Or they could try to break through the Soviet lines after dark and make for Berlin. No one spoke. Friedrich realized that he had not eaten in 2 days, that he could not remember the last time he had slept, that his hands had stopped shaking because he no longer had the energy for fear. Peter from Hamburg was dead. Klaus was dead. Hauptmann Kessler was dead. Home seemed like something from a story he had heard once, long ago, about someone else's life. They left the factory at midnight, moving through ruins that provided cover, but also hid 1,000 ways to die. Dietrich led them in single file, communicating only through hand signals. Every footstep carefully placed to avoid the debris that littered the streets like the bones of the town itself. Soviet patrols moved through the darkness, their voices carrying in the cold air, speaking in a language that sounded to Friedrich like water running over stones. Twice, they froze in the shadows while soldiers passed within meters of them. Close enough that Friedrich could smell their tobacco, could hear them laughing about something he would never understand. Twice they survived by becoming statues, by forgetting how to breathe, by willing themselves invisible. They reached the edge of Silo as dawn began to break, the sky turning the color of a bruise. Behind them, the town burned with flames that would consume everything, erasing streets where children had once played, homes where families had gathered, the church where Friedrich had slept his last peaceful sleep. Ahead lay open countryside, then forest, then the long road to Berlin. Dietrich told them to move fast. That daylight made them targets, that their only advantage was the slim hope that Soviet forces would assume no one had escaped. They ran across frozen fields, their breath forming clouds in the morning air, their boots crunching on frost that sparkled like broken glass. Friedrich's lungs burned. His legs threatened to give out beneath him. He ran anyway because the alternative was stopping, and stopping meant dying. They were halfway across the field when the aircraft appeared. It came low and fast, a Soviet fighter on reconnaissance, its engine screaming as it descended toward them. There was nowhere to hide, no cover, nothing but open ground and 19 boys silhouetted against white frost. Dietrich shouted for them to scatter. The plane's guns opened up with a sound like canvas tearing, tracers stitching lines across the field. Boys fell like puppets with cut strings. Friedrich threw himself flat, his face pressed into frozen earth, his hands over his head as if that might protect him from bullets traveling faster than sound. The plane passed over, banked, came around for another pass. More gunfire. More boys falling. Then the plane was gone, climbing back into the dawn sky. Its pilot perhaps satisfied, perhaps low on ammunition, perhaps merely bored with easy targets. When Friedrich lifted his head, 11 of them remained. Dietrich was not among the survivors. The sergeant lay on his back with his eyes open, staring at the sky he could no longer see. A thin line of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Friedrich wanted to close those eyes, wanted to say something, wanted to feel something other than the numbness that had settled over him like ice. But there was no time. The remaining boys gathered without speaking, without a leader, bound together only by the animal instinct to survive. They reached the forest as full daylight came, disappearing into trees that offered shelter and shadow and the promise of continued flight. Have you ever considered how quickly a child can stop being a child? How many horrors does it take before innocence becomes impossible to remember? The forest became their world. They moved west by compass and instinct, avoiding roads where Soviet convoys rumbled past in endless columns, avoiding villages where gunfire and screams suggested that the war was not yet finished with its killing. They drank from streams still crusted with ice. They ate whatever they could find, which was almost nothing. One boy, whose name Friedrich never learned, died on the third day in the forest, simply sitting down against a tree and refusing to stand again. His eyes remained open but empty, as if his soul had decided to leave before his body caught up. They could not bury him. They had nothing to dig with, and staying in one place meant death of a different kind. They left him there, another marker on a trail of abandoned children that stretched across Germany. By the time they reached the outskirts of Berlin, only 7 remained. The city they found was barely recognizable as a place where human beings lived. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Streets blocked by mountains of brick and twisted metal. Buildings standing like broken teeth against a sky perpetually gray with smoke. Soviet forces had encircled the city, tightening their grip day by day. And inside that shrinking perimeter, the last defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were already dead. Friedrich and the others slipped through the chaos like ghosts, ignored by soldiers too busy dying to care about a handful of filthy boys in Wehrmacht uniforms, 3 sizes too large. Friedrich finally reached his street on April 28th. The journey from Silo had taken 12 days. He had aged a lifetime. The building where he had lived, where his mother had baked him that birthday cake in January, no longer existed. A direct hit had collapsed the entire structure into its own basement, leaving only a crater filled with rubble and the scattered remnants of lives that had ended in an instant. Friedrich stood at the edge of that crater and felt nothing. The numbness that had sustained him through the retreat, through the forest, through the dying city, had become absolute. He could not cry, he could not scream. He could only stare at the space where his childhood had been and understand that it was gone as completely as if it had never existed. One of the other boys, a 15-year-old named Otto, put a hand on his shoulder. They had not spoken much during their flight, communication reduced to necessary gestures and warnings. But Otto said something then that Friedrich would remember for the rest of his life. He said that surviving was not the same as living, that they had been turned into something neither child nor soldier, something the world would not know what to do with when the war finally ended. He said this quietly, without emotion, as if he were describing the weather. Then he took his hand from Friedrich's shoulder and walked away into the ruined city. Friedrich never saw him again. Friedrich spent the final days of the war in the basement of a partially destroyed apartment building, sheltering with a dozen other survivors who had nowhere else to go. There were old men too frail to have been conscripted, women clutching children who had forgotten how to play, and a few other soldiers' boys, mostly, who wore the same hollow expression Friedrich saw when he caught his reflection in shattered glass. They shared what little food remained, rationing crumbs and dirty water, listening to the sounds of battle drawing closer, wondering if liberation would come as a bullet or a bomb. No one spoke of the future, because the future had become impossible to imagine beyond the next hour, the next minute, the next breath. On May 2nd, the shooting stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that at first, no one believed it. They waited in that basement, afraid that emerging would mean walking into crossfire, that the quiet was merely a pause before something worse. But the silence held. Eventually, someone climbed the stairs and looked out into the street. Soviet soldiers were there, lowering their weapons, lighting cigarettes, looking as exhausted as the city they had conquered. The war in Berlin was over. The war everywhere was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, its 1,000-year Reich having lasted exactly 12 years. Friedrich emerged into daylight that seemed too bright, too ordinary for what it was illuminating. Soviet troops were moving through the streets, some helping civilians, some searching buildings. Some simply sitting amid the rubble with expressions that suggested they too could not quite believe they had survived. An officer approached Friedrich, saw his Wehrmacht uniform, and barked something in Russian. Friedrich raised his hands, empty, too tired to be afraid. The officer looked at him more closely, at his size, at his face still bearing traces of childhood despite everything it had witnessed. The officer said something else, softer this time, and waved him away. He did not take Friedrich prisoner. Perhaps he had children of his own. Perhaps he simply had no desire to arrest a boy who looked more dead than alive. Friedrich wandered through Berlin for 3 days, searching. He checked survivor lists posted in public squares, asked at aid stations, showed his mother's photograph to anyone who would look. No one had seen her. No one had heard her name. The lists of the dead were longer than the lists of the living. And most of the dead had no names attached, just numbers representing bodies pulled from ruins. On the 4th day, he found his father in a hospital that had been set up in what remained of a school. The older man had lost his remaining arm in the final Soviet assault, had lost 40 pounds, had lost any resemblance to the person Friedrich remembered. But he was alive. When he saw Friedrich, he wept. These were the first tears Friedrich had seen since leaving home, and he found himself unable to join them. That capacity had been burned out of him somewhere between Seelow and Berlin. If you have stayed with this story, if you have witnessed these truths that demand to be remembered, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. History depends on those willing to listen to its most difficult lessons. And your engagement helps ensure these voices will not be forgotten. Friedrich Hartmann lived until 1998. He married, raised 2 daughters, worked as a mechanic in a garage that repaired cars instead of weapons. He never spoke about the war, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone who asked. The letters he had written to his mother, the ones she had saved until her death, were discovered by his oldest daughter while sorting through family documents. She brought them to him, thinking he might want them back. He looked at them for a long time, at the handwriting that belonged to a child he no longer recognized as himself, and asked her to burn them. She refused. She said they were evidence, that they mattered, that history needed these testimonies. He said that history had taken enough from him already. But the letters survived, as did Friedrich's story, pieced together from those written words and from military records, and from the accounts of the 6 other boys who made it out of Seelow alive. Of those 6, 2 took their own lives before reaching 30. 3 lived long lives marked by nightmares and silence. 1, Otto, the boy who had spoken to Friedrich in the ruins, became a teacher. He spent 40 years educating children about the war. Not through dates and battle statistics, but through the simple, terrible truth of what it meant to send children to die for ideas they were too young to understand. He died in 2003, and at his funeral, former students spoke about how he had taught them that the real casualty of war was not counted in bodies, but in the theft of futures. The erasure of who people might have become if given the chance to grow up in peace. The photograph that began this story, the one found beneath the rubble of that Berlin schoolhouse, hangs now in a museum dedicated to the final days of the Second World War. 11 children with rifles and empty eyes, frozen in a moment that should never have existed. Historians have identified 7 of them. The other 4 remain nameless, their families lost, their stories ending without record or witness. Friedrich Hartmann is 3rd from the left, barely visible in the smoke. His face turned slightly away from the camera, as if already trying to escape the moment that would define the rest of his life. We tell these stories not to glorify war or to assign simple blame, but because forgetting is a kind of second death, a final erasure of lives already interrupted. The children who fought at Seelow, at Berlin, at 100 other desperate last stands across a dying Reich, were victims long before they became soldiers. They were robbed of their innocence, their futures, their right to the ordinary miracle of growing up. Some survived in body, but remained forever trapped in those April days when childhood ended and something else, something without a proper name, began. We remember them, not as heroes or villains, but as what they were, children who deserved better than the world gave them, whose stories stand as testament to the obscenity of turning youth into weapons. May we never forget what it costs when we ask the young to pay for the failures of the old. May we never stop asking ourselves if we are building a world worthy of the children who will inherit it.